Welcome everybody to our webinar today on fall protection. It's our question and answer session and Ask the Experts broadcast. So first off, my name is Matt Burtney. I'm the content marketer at Levitt-Safety. If you've been watching along on our fall protection series, I might be familiar to you. And if I do look familiar, you'll also recognize this voice, Jennifer Abraham.
Hello, and nice to hear your voice again, Matt. It's been a few weeks. My life hasn't been the same since we've been apart. What can I say?
Been way too long, that's for sure.
It has been a long time. It feels like a really long time. We had such a great time doing all these webinar series and stuff since our first one was August 25th, and now it's November 24th. So we've been regular visitors via live chat for several weeks now. So we've been doing some really great things. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to go through the webinars and stuff. Hopefully everybody's aware, if they go through all of those webinars, they're successfully tested out in those webinars and stuff. That's actually counts as a prerequisite to enter them into the qualified inspector program. So that's a savings of over $800. And I thought it would be a really great idea to have some of your subject matter experts and my subject matter experts and put them on the hook this time. Me and you get to sit back today. We get to listen to everybody else do all the hard work and answer a bunch of questions. I'm certainly here for support as well. So we just thought it would be a really nice way to kind of round off the webinar series is by having a nice live chat, a live discussion, questions. If people need, they're looking for some solutions. Sometimes there could be all the best intentions out there, but we just can't quite seem to find the right equipment on our own that's going to suit our problems or fix our problems. So I'm really excited to have this session, and I certainly hope there's a few people in attendance and stuff as well, so that we can have some really great discussions, and hopefully people are going to learn some things from each other as the questions are being asked. So just please remember, if you're somebody out there that wants to ask a question, just ask it. The only stupid question is the one that is not asked. So whatever question you've got, please realize there's probably 10 other people that want to ask the same question. So now's your chance. Use us, abuse us. We're here for you. You've got us for the next 45 minutes or hour or so. So I'm going to stop yapping for a change, and I'll pass it back over to Matt.
Thank you, Jennifer. So joining us today, we have Gary Ray, who is the market segment manager with Levitt-Safety for confined space and fall protection. And then we have Scott Patrick, and Scott is the fall protection specialist for Honeywell, and so he covers Ontario and Western Canada, is it?
It's currently Ontario, and effective Jan 1 in the new year, it will be Ontario and the West.
Okay, perfect. So basically how it's going to work today is we're just going to get through as many questions as we can from both people who have submitted questions in advance, and then live questions that come up as we're running through this. So I am going to hop on to our questions, and the first one is, can you go through some of the common types of fall protection equipment, and what is fall protection PPE?
So fall protection can be best described as, and I can use an acronym, the ABCs of fall protection, which is your anchorage, your body wear, and your connecting device. So that's basically the three components you needed for an active fall arrest type situation. So anchorage would be any type of structure combined with an anchor product like a web sling or a cable sling, beam clamp, a permanent bolted or welded D-ring potentially. So that's your A. Your body wear, of course, is your harness. And every harness is constructed from 5,000-pound webbing, regardless of its comfort features, color, etc. There are a lot of comfort features which we include to mitigate fatigue. And of course, the more comfort features we add, the price goes up from compliance. But all of our harnesses are built on the same body form and are very comfortable, even if we don't have comfort features like stretch or padding or things like that. and then your connecting device, whether it be a simple lanyard or an energy absorbing lanyard, and which also can be replaced by a small retractable device. So that's the basics of fall protection.
Beauty. All right, thank you very much.
Not a problem.
We'll get into, let's see. We were talking about this a little bit before we hopped onto the call, and it was some pretty interesting stuff. So we'll go to CSA standards now. And what are the notable CSA standard changes for fall protection that have come around in the last couple of years?
So to start, in 2017, the CSA standard for SRLs changed. And the main changes were the inclusion of 2 new types. So in the past, we basically had type 1, type 2, and type 3, which was anything under 10 feet, which was a type 1, anything over 10 feet in length was a type 2, and anything over 10 feet with a rescue device built into it, like a retrieval handle, was classed as a type 3. So those terms have all been done away with. And now we have SRL non-repairable, which is anything under 10 feet, SRL repairable, which is anything over 10 feet, and SRL-R, which is a repairable device over 10 feet that also includes a rescue component. Now, the 2 new types that were introduced in 2017 were SRL-LE, which is leading edge, which is a situation that wasn't addressed very well in years gone by, but is gaining a lot of focus with the MOL when they're doing their inspections now, and SRL-R-LE, so a leading edge rescue. And to this point, I've yet to see a leading edge rescue device anywhere. So if one manufacturer must be bringing one to market if it's a new CSA product. The other change was the max weight. So in Canada previously, we were at 310 pounds max capacity on most of our SRLs. That's now been pushed to a maximum of 420. So anything that we make that meets CSA currently, which is our Mighty Vacs, our Falcon LEs, and a variety of other devices, all are rated at 420 pounds capacity. Another change is in their design. So in the past, longer SRLs, which are drum wound, so 20 foot, 30 foot, 50 foot, 100 foot devices, are not ribbon wound like the very short units that you use to replace a lanyard, like say a turbo light, for instance. Drum wound, if you were to lay them on their side, they would pay out correctly, but wouldn't retract very well. And the design's been changed so that they retract perfectly, even laying on their side now, under the new CSA standard. The third change was regarding certification or recertification. So in the past, you purchased an SRL, and 2 years from the date of your purchase or date of manufacture, which are hopefully fairly close, you would return your unit for recertification, and then every year thereafter, or if that SRL was involved in a fall, then it would go back immediately. So with the latest change in 2017, there is now a 1, 2, or 5 year service interval, and it is self-assessed by the user or customer, and it's entirely based on the frequency of use and the type of environment that the device is used in. So in most cases, I could see customers moving to 2 years. All of the products that we make are very robust, and I don't think 2 years would be an issue under normal use. But you take a look at some hazardous industries, so foundries, underground mining, very dusty areas where dust can get into the housing and things like that. I might want to stick with a 1 year, simply because of the hazard of the environment it's being used in. But if it's a clean area like a lab, I don't see an issue with 2 years, depending on how frequently they're using it. So those that's the change for SRLs, and that was the first one. Then in 2020, in February, new CSA standard came into effect, and we had to start making an entire new line of lanyards for Canada. In the past, we take an American lanyard and submit it to CSA, and then we could sell it in Canada. Now there are drastic differences between CSA and the US on lanyards. In Canada, the energy pack must cover a weight range of 100 to 420 pounds. We currently offer So what we did as a company was take a look at our offering, and there used to be lanyards which would extend in length to absorb the energy of the fall. And there are also energy pack types or shock pack types that you're used to seeing with the large pack at the one end. And we have eliminated all of the elongating type. What we found in our internal tests is they would only handle a weight upwards of about 200 pounds in a fall. So we've eliminated them, gone to energy packs on everything. And we now cover a weight range of 100 to 335. And of course, anything above that, I recommend moving to an SRL, because the engineering required to arrest a worker's fall to around 900 pounds force on the body is fairly difficult over 335 pounds, unfortunately. So those are the major changes with CSA in the last couple of years.
Sweet. Thank you very much.
Just to add a little bit to that, when it comes to the inspection frequency of those new lanyards, you know, in our webinars, I expressed a lot of unhappiness, maybe we'll call it. There just leaves a lot of room for perception, because like as Scott said, you know, depending on where you're working, the type of job you're doing, how often you're doing it, storage conditions, all of this stuff. So if you're using the self-retracting device outdoors, you know, poor storage conditions, harsh conditions, but you know, it basically talks about a light duty task, moderate, and heavy duty. Well, you know, as I'd said in the webinars before, you know, my husband's an iron worker. Well, his light or moderate duties are far different than mine would be. So it's all relative in comparison, unfortunately. So what one person might think is moderate, somebody else might think that that's actually heavy use. So I always like to see when standards and legislation change that we're actually working our way out of gray area, not creating more gray area. So those, you know, I like to be very realistic and say, hey, this part is fantastic. And then sometimes I'll go, hey, this part isn't that great, you know. So we don't always have to like the changes. We just need to be aware of them. One of the other things that I noticed on one of the newest harness standards was that there is no longer, which makes me crazy, it actually does not state anywhere in the standard that harnesses actually have to have the weight requirement listed on the label any longer, which makes zero sense to me whatsoever. And as we've been going through qualified inspector classes, we have people take 10 of their own pieces of equipment that need to be inspected, and they bring them into class with them. And a lot of people are showing up with these harnesses that were not, you know, made in 2019, 2020, and they don't have any weight limitations and stuff, which makes no sense, because as Scott's already told you, you know, we've now made changes to some of our lanyards, and just because we made those changes doesn't mean that everything else, we can't use it anymore. We're still using those things. So we've got lanyards anywhere from, you know, we had the E4s and the E6s. Some of those are still out there. So, you know, you may have a lanyard that's only good for 256 pounds. Then you got something that's new that's good to 420. But our lanyard is only making it, our harness is only making it to 350. So there are a lot of different changes. And as we've stated before, legislation does not change at the same time the CSA standards do. So typically they're quoting things that aren't even really that accurate any longer, because they haven't updated legislation for 5 years or something. But then they love to say, or as per manufacturer specifications. So like, hey, you should listen to this, but PS, you know, in case we're wrong, you should always listen to the manufacturer anyway. So unfortunately, all the worker out in the field has is the information that's on that label, on that tag for him. So I'm super disappointed to hear CSA, and I actually checked with our compliance people and with the standard, and they checked with CSA, and we're just not finding anything that's a criteria. My best hope is that the manufacturers are going to still continue to do a best practice of putting the weight restrictions on there. I'll throw away the key.
Oh no, we love your knowledge. Gary, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. So Gary, you have quite a background in guardrails and passive fall protection, is it?
Yeah, the last 8 years before I came back to Levitt was in engineered systems, and primarily most of our projects ended up being passive fall protection systems like guardrails and netting and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Which, so if anyone has any questions on guardrails and passive fall protection, this is your opportunity. So the first question.
There was a question in the about how do you attach around a mechanical rooftop equipment. So that's what these types of systems are designed for. They're actually counterweighted systems, so they're non-penetrating. They're designed to meet or exceed the actual building code as a permanent guardrail. So they're designed for things like mechanical equipment, serviceable mechanical equipment that's too close to the edge, hatch openings, access points like fixed ladders, around skylights. The skylight's considered a hole in your roof, so that type of thing. So that's about it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Question that came in from Jonathan. I think I'll throw it to you, Scott. This is a specific question regarding work positioning systems. When accessing an anchorage point, what is the industry practice when mounting and dismounting from these points?
So to clarify, you're trying to get to an actual fall anchorage, but you're tied off in the meantime, trying to get to it?
When accessing an anchorage point, what is the best practice when mounting and dismounting? So I think so, yeah.
Okay, so the basic underlying issue is that you need to be connected 100% of the time. So if you have to transfer from a positioning system to an actual fall arrest anchorage, you cannot disconnect from one until you're connected to the other. So I hope that answers it. If it's more intricate than that, I'd be happy to explain in further detail.
In some instances, it may be wise to check with your occupational health and safety. Some people are very scared of these people. They are not to be feared. They are a resource. They would rather you call them and ask them questions than somebody like me calls them because you're doing unfit fall protection behaviors. So I had an OH&S buddy. He told me once that in some instances, and it was in a roofing application, sometimes it's not possible to be able to be tied off, and there is that transition period. And typically our transition period is one of the most dangerous times. You're accessing from one point to another, you're accessing or egressing. So like Scott said, whenever possible, 100% tie off. If that is not going to be possible, I strongly suggest you pick up the phone, call your local occupational health and safety people and say, this is the situation I have. What is going to make you happy in this situation? So some people just go, I'm just going to guess and maybe I'll guess what OH&S wants me to do. Don't be scared of them. They're there as a resource. They would rather you call them 50 times than they be called out once because it's a fatality. So feel free to use your occupational health and safety. Call them, ask them, this is what our plan is. Is this going to be acceptable? And they will give you, they'll say, yeah, no, that's not good, or this is what our expectation is. They're not going to sit there, and make you guess. They're going to be happy that you called them.
Yeah, just to add to that, Jennifer, as well, about the only time you're ever going to find instances where somebody has to work unattached could potentially be seen in residential construction. So there's the first person that has to go up and attach the anchorage, and then they can attach themselves and install other anchorages for the other workers. So there are times where somebody will have to be non-attached. If the customer feels like they can't or don't want to do that, we've got other types of equipment with extendable poles, etc., that can maybe allow some better options in terms of somewhere.
A lot of times there's a way to do it, but the problem is that some people just have no idea all the fall protection equipment that's available to them. I spent 10 years out in the field in oil and gas, and my first day working with Honeywell, North Safety Products, I showed up in Toronto, and Ray Mullen was my instructor, and I just got blasted with so much fall protection equipment. Then I spent 2 days with a guy from CSA, and there was like tables and tables and tables. I saw, pole climbing devices, pole chokers, like all kinds of stuff that, a shepherd's hook, the first man up system, all kinds of stuff that I had no idea even after being out in the field for 10 years. So this is exactly why we got Scott and Gary to come to the conversation, Because if people do have some application questions, you know, these are the guys, man. These are the guys that are like, you know, you tell them your scenario and they're going to tell you if there's a piece of equipment out there that can accommodate that or not.
Also too, Matt, please feel free to share my contact info with everybody on the call. And if they have questions that maybe aren't covered in our discussion today, feel free to reach out by email or by cell phone. And I'm more than happy to work with anybody to help them resolve some fall arrest issues.
For sure, yeah, we'll include everybody's contact info for the everyone who's attended today. We have a question from the chat about someone who is in Ontario, and the question is, if a fall arrest harness is used for an actual fall, can it still be used afterwards? It doesn't have to be removed from service.
The minute your harness is involved in a fall, it must be tagged out, cut up, and thrown out. It cannot be, why I say cut up is because a fall arrest harness is designed, very nice. A fall arrest harness is designed to save your life once. Once it is not intended to be reused. So to simply throw it in the garbage and have the potential for somebody else to take it out and take it home for their personal use, you never want to see that happen. So cut the leg straps, cut a shoulder strap, and throw it out.
Cut a load bearing strap. That's a minimum criteria, is to cut a load bearing strap. I've actually had somebody come into my qualified inspector class, and he knew he needed to do this service, essentially this qualified inspector documented service. He had failed a harness, and he called me a week later and he said, my employer wants to know if this failed harness, if I can use it for rescue in confined space. No, if it's a fail, it's a fail. You know, if it's got, you know, broken strands, broken threads, been exposed to any type of fall, you know, physical abuse, damage, deterioration, you've got one good shot at this, and that's it. So yeah, Scott's absolutely 100% correct. One good time shot, and that's it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, the next question, is fall arrest necessary when working above 3 meters on a ladder, or is the ability to maintain 3 points of contact when necessary, as stated in the CSA standard, acceptable?
So on a ladder, 3 points of contact is actually classed as fall prevention. So the minute you have to remove one or both of your hands to perform some work, you now need a third tether to that ladder, which generally is side D-rings on a harness with a positioning device, a short one that you can attach to a rung of the ladder to maintain those 3 points and work freely with 2 hands.
I would also double check with your applicable legislation, because depending on the province you work in, they may say specific things. So in Alberta, they used to say things like the task had to be a short duty task of a light duty task of short duration. There we go. So they had specific requirements if you were going to be working on a ladder. So some provinces, so just because CSA says something, remember you need to know CSA and you need to know your legislation, because CSA may say, yeah, your 3 points of contact is fine, where your provincial legislation may actually say, no, excuse me, they just say anything over 10 feet. You know, they don't say if you're over 10 feet and you're on a ladder and you've got 3 points of contact, you don't have to wear fall protection. That is not what legislation says. So that's why we need to be well versed in both CSA standards and other standards, as well as our provincial legislation.
One thing that I would like to add as well is not just the provincial legislation, but also where your customers are working. There could be end users that have very different regs in-house when you're working. I do know a few that even though the reg in Ontario is 10 feet, they work with 6. And also in Ontario, federal is 8, which makes no sense to me. Provincially we're 10, federally we're 8. But again, provincially it changes, and with some large end users, they may have what they consider to be safer practices for tying off, but it becomes very, very difficult to tie off safely below 10 feet. Even at 10 feet height, if you tie off, there is the potential to still hit the ground, depending on where you're anchoring.
Beauty. So this one is a very specific question. but I'm going to throw it out there and you guys let me know because this is live from the chat today, so it makes sense. How often do fall restrict equipment for wood pole climbing in Alberta need to be inspected? Is it a daily or an annual thing? And does it need to have a third-party inspection?
All right, so every user has to do a pre-use inspection on all of their fall protection products before each use. So every day before they don it, if it's a harness and a lanyard or a harness and an SRL, it must be inspected before you use it. We also, as a manufacturer, recommend annual inspection of all soft goods by a competent inspector. So that doesn't necessarily have to be third party. Somebody in your own company could be trained to do it. You could bring in a manufacturer rep like myself or Jennifer, or then there are companies as well that you can contract to come in as a third party, pay them, and they will inspect for you.
Scott, let me ask you this. Where could they find that training?
Right here with you.
What is the name of that training? No, you're not Matt. I won't get on your case. Matt knows the answer to this one anyways. So that would be the qualified inspector training. So every time that you guys see that the manufacturer, recommends maybe annually, like Scott said, or maybe it's every 6 months, every 12 months. Again, in the qualified inspector class, we talk about putting together a documented scheduled inspection program. So just because we say annually as a manufacturer for that qualified inspector, that is not to say that if you've got, you've got iron workers, maybe you've got cement, mason, concrete guys that have got, this concrete dust in their stuff all the time. Somebody goes to do a shutdown with a reactor and they've got coker dust all over their stuff all the time. That's not going to make it for a year. So we really need to sit down. Your qualified inspector, your safety person should really be sitting down and going, okay, the scaffolders are this group. They're wearing their harnesses every single day, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, and they're doing stuff all the time. Where I want to say qualified inspector, the QI guy, the QC guy, there you go, the quality control guy, he goes out and, maybe he doesn't actually leave the ground. Maybe once a month he's wearing his harness and he's in ideal conditions, he stores it inside. So it all depends on all of these things as to what the frequency should actually be for you to get that qualified inspector stuff done. So like Scott said, it's a service that I would rather teach other people to do it than do it myself. And I'd rather teach you to do it so you don't have to go pay someone else to do it. It is it can be a very simple process if you make it that way. And it certainly can be a huge money saver for the employer for sure to have somebody trained to be able to do that. Take the webinars and join Qualified Inspector.
And that's why the pre-use inspection is so important. If a user finds that the webbing is stiff or frayed for some reason, or it just doesn't look normal, they can tag it out of service, use another one, and then at some point have it inspected by the qualified inspector to see if it's still fit for use.
And we have a question here. One of the clarifications is the 10 feet from the head or from the feet?
From your feet.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. Is it okay to use the same anchor point that another person is connected to? And they asked specifically for over the edge recovery system, but we're already shaking our heads no.
We're like, no.
That's unanimous.
One anchor per person, unless you're using something like a horizontal lifeline. Sorry, Scott, I stole your thunder.
Oh, that's okay. Right answer.
Should we expand on the horizontal lifeline and why only one anchor point?
Take it away, Scott.
Not a problem. So a horizontal lifeline is a cable or rope system stretched. If it's a temporary system, you can max out at about a 60-foot span without an intermediate. And then there are more permanent systems, which are cable most of the time or all the time. And we can do spans of any length at all using intermediates. What it does is allow greater movement for workers on at a height if they have to access multiple points for service or walk along a crane rail. Being 100% tied off doesn't make a lot of sense if you're using something like a Y lanyard, where you're attaching one, going back for the one that's already attached, moving it a little further down, attaching it. So that can be time consuming. So horizontal lifelines eliminate the need for that, and you can basically walk the whole length, no matter what it is, being attached the whole time, and your shuttle or carrier will pass the intermediates automatically. So you don't have to move your connecting device at all. You can just walk and it will follow behind you and you're attached the whole time. The one thing that I will say about horizontal lifelines is if the system includes an energy absorber, you may only require 5,000 pound anchor points. Permanent systems are engineered, do not contain an energy absorber generally, and anchor points can be required upwards of about 16,000 pounds. So if there is a horizontal lifeline application, definitely get us involved and we can help you determine what type of system to use. The other thing that I will warn everybody about is that when one worker falls, all the workers go. And most systems are a 2-worker system. So on short spans, like 60 feet with no intermediates, if the first worker falls, the second one goes with them. And they meet somewhere down in the middle to say hello and wait for rescue.
Usually the pre-engineered ones are engineered for 2 workers.
Correct.
And engineered systems can be, usually it's a minimum of 2, but depending on the application, they can go higher.
Correct. Depending on the number
more than 2
of intermediates, yeah, we can go up from there. Even on temporary systems, there are specific applications where if we add an additional energy absorber, one at each end, we can add extra workers. With our shock fusion posts on the roof, we do have what's called the fusion system, or shock fusion system. The fusion posts are connected with a lifeline. And by adding extra posts or intermediates, we can add extra workers to the system.
All right. The next question is fall protection training and working at heights training different things?
So a new standard came out a few years ago, and the province introduced a requirement for training providers to have their course approved to deliver to the construction market. And it was then called working at heights training for construction. That was supposed to be migrated out to the other industries, industrial and everything else, but it hasn't made it there yet. A lot of companies in the other markets have been thinking a little proactively and taking it as a requirement in case it comes into their market segment. My honest opinion of the training, that is Ontario approved, because I've sat through numerous courses from at least 6 or 7 providers, and not enough of the content is fall protection. A lot of it is directed at the construction industry and not enough about safe work practices with fall protection. So I'd like to see some more content added to those courses, but straight up fall arrest, all you're getting is fall arrest. And
the MOL actually came out, I believe it was the end of 2019 or beginning of 2020, and they actually said that they will now actually accept other training in Ontario as well. And I don't know if it was a 2020 thing, maybe it was a pandemic reason that they did that. But yeah, you're right. They thought it was going to catch on like wildfire, and unfortunately, you know, it's just end user fall protection training. But please remember, 15 times on every page in everybody's legislation, it says, or as per manufacturer specifications. So, you know, we've dealt with a variety of different organizations that have standards for training and things like that. And guess who they heavily rely on to get their accurate content? The manufacturer, because that's all we're quoting is manufacturer specifications, which came to us from ANSI, CSA, from these different places that tell us how to build our equipment and what needs to be rated for, you know, what it needs to be designed for. So yeah, sometimes it's I don't know what else to tell you about that. So yeah, it's just training. It's another form of fall protection training. And like Scott said, some of the fall protection training out there is awesome, and some of it is going to leave a lot to be desired, unfortunately. So, you know, there's a current standard body right now in Alberta that's decided they want to make it Canadian-wide standard, and they're going to take over the world. And in the meantime, I've seen their program, and Honeywell has simply stepped back from it and said, this is just not the quality of information we want to be providing to people. So, you know, Honeywell does have their own end user programs. You know, we are approved by the BCCSA as well, if you're in British Columbia. And we've also got an end user program that's good for everybody across the country. So you can send your workers to our class virtually. I need to see them. They have to see me. I have to be able to talk to them. They have to be able to talk to me. And they can actually be tested out in multiple different provinces, because how you wear a harness in Ontario is exactly how I'm supposed to wear a harness in British Columbia and in Alberta. So the content of fall protection doesn't change. It's the legislation sometimes that changes. So other than that, you know, the requirements of a horizontal lifeline or a harness or whatever, that's the same when it comes from the manufacturer. So hopefully that helps.
Correct.
Okay, and our next question, when there's more than one worker required to use fall protection, do they all need to be certified, or can the supervisor be certified and knowledgeable and be in a position and work area to properly supervise less knowledgeable workers?
So anybody that is using fall protection should take fall protection training. And I would actually go a little further and say must take fall protection training to be able to use it, know the hazards, know how to attach. There are lots of issues that come up while you're working that you have to be pre-trained to be able to handle in the field. So a supervisor simply being trained to watch over an untrained person wearing fall protection is not a situation that I would ever like to see.
And the supervisor should have even more information. You know, for those of you that took the webinars, you remember at the very beginning, we talked about competency and we talked about due diligence. So your supervisor is not there all the time. They've got multiple different crews typically to deal with. And I know my legislation in Alberta says the employer must train workers on the fall protection equipment and systems that they are going to use. So all the workers need to be trained. But one thing that's kind of missing sometimes is I don't sometimes see the supervision in the fall protection training. They should be taking at least the same fall protection training their workers are, but please, I would like them to take even more. Those are the folks that should definitely be seeing them in our qualified inspector classes and things like that. That's for supervision. So we're talking about competency and due diligence. You know, you truly should be knowing more than the people that you're directing, so that when you're looking at something as a supervisor, you can effectively assess whether that's happening properly or not. The other thing is that there should be competency checks happening. Well, part of a competency check is to ensure you've been trained to use whatever equipment it is, whether it's a fall protection competency check, an elevated work platform competency check. One of the main things of that competency check is to see if people have actually been trained to use that equipment or not. So my OH&S buddy I had before, I said, hey, listen, hypothetical situation, what if me as a third-party training provider does a really crappy job of training? Not here. Okay, I'm just saying hypothetical. So we do a bad job of training and a worker hurts himself. Whose fault? Who's in trouble? Is that me, the third party, for having a crappy class, or is that the employer? And he said that's 110% the employer. He said if we come to investigate that instance, we're going to look at what training did the worker take, and after that, if the training wasn't any good and we look into it, we're going to say, what did the employer do to ensure their due diligence to make sure the worker actually learned what he was supposed to learn that was applicable to him in that training class? So if the employer just sends the workers to training and he has no idea what's included in the training, that's also bad. That's really bad. The employer will be seen as not doing their due diligence, and it's not going to be on the third-party training provider. 110%, it's all going to be on the employer. So Absolutely. Train your supervision, train your workers. Everybody needs to be trained.
The employer has to be able to kind of envision themselves standing in front of a judge and telling them that they did everything they could to prevent that from happening. And if they can picture that, then great. But if they can't, that's the problem.
If they can't, they're going to be fined and they might go to jail, because that's the way she goes in Canada. I actually just wrote a blog for Honeywell about due diligence, and it was funny because I used one example from Canada, and they're like, "This is US." I'm like, listen, it's an example. Just because you guys haven't got to the point that we have about due diligence in Canada, I definitely wanted to illustrate the points that people are being fined and they're going to jail for not doing their due diligence in Canada. And just because other countries maybe are not there yet, they still need to understand how important it is. We weren't there, and all of a sudden one day we were there. You know, the government was like, you all are not listening. And like I said before, if you were in any of my other webinars, pain is a great teacher. So what hurts an employer the most? When it costs them money, right? So we found that, you know, OH&S and the government found people were not fixing things the way they didn't really care as much as they should. And they weren't fixing things the way they should. They weren't being proactive enough and doing their due diligence. You know, due diligence is demonstrated by what you do before an incident occurs, not after. So, you know, it's all about being proactive, not reactive. I did promise I couldn't be quiet for the whole thing, right?
No, we very much value your input, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure. So this next one's about tie-offs and the best place. It's a very specific question, but we'll run with it and see what happens. We're a manufacturing company. We build tankers, hydrovac trucks, and sometimes the guys are working on top of these units, and they're over 3 meters. We have overhead cranes, but I don't know, we do not have anchor points above them. Where and how do you suggest tying off?
Generally, an engineer could get involved to specify where somebody can attach, tie off, weld or bolt a D-ring based on the structure itself. I'll give you a good example. If you're familiar with flat roofs, if you've seen the red trusses above with the angled bracing, they're generally 6 or 8 feet apart across the entire flat roof. They are rated for a 5,000 pound load, not a problem. You can tie off to them in fall protection. But if you happen to live in parts of the country where snow load becomes an issue, you cannot tie off to those same trusses in the wintertime, because that extra safety factor that they have is now being tied up in supporting the snow load on the roof. So when you're looking for something to tie off to, there's a wealth of information out there about the strength of structural steel and other types of structure. And there are instances where an engineer could also get involved and say to a worker who has to tie off to something that may not meet 5,000 pounds, but it will support a fall and the arrest. And the engineer will factor in how much you weigh, what you ate that morning for breakfast, everything you're wearing from your tool belt to your hard hat, etc. They'll do a couple quick calculations, and for one day somebody could be allowed to work on an anchorage that doesn't meet 5,000 pounds to do a certain job. But in general, it would be a great idea to look into what the strength of a piece of structure actually is before you tie off to it. One company that I've dealt with in the past did a great job, and I've rarely seen this, but for any hoisting applications, all of the anchor points for hoisting were circled with a fluorescent orange paint, and any tie-off points for fall protection had a sprayed circle around them in fluorescent green paint. And everybody was taught what the difference was. Now, in the real world, I have seen people tie off to hoisting anchorages because they tend to far surpass the 5,000 pound mark for required strength. But in the world of safety and fall protection, you cannot tie off to something unless it was tested for fall protection.
I think that application mentioned an overhead crane as well, and that always throws a big wrench into things because you're going to interfere with the load on the crane. In a perfect world, and we had this question many times in my past life, can we tie off to the crane? And the answer is no. We won't find an inspector who will let that happen. So often what you need to do is something, there are devices that are portable, like portable gantries, portable horizontal systems that you can actually roll into place over the truck or over the, whatever it is you're trying to get up on. That's your best solution, but there's lots of ways around it. Best thing to do is to come and have a look at the application if that's
Absolutely. Speaking to systems that are available to work underneath of a crane, we have a product called our Skyord, and what it is an overhead portable anchorage that you can move around, and no counterweight is needed. It maxes out at 20 feet in height, which should sit underneath any overhead crane, and you can work on top of a truck, bed, an LTL trailer, what have you, simply by parking on it. The vehicle becomes the counterweight. That's an interesting product.
Speaking of new products, we have somebody asking about leading edge SRLs. It's something they hadn't heard of before, and just wondering a little bit about it, the applications, and kind of, what can you do with it, and what can you not do with an SRL LE?
So a leading edge SRL is fully approved for foot level tie off. And in instances where you may be using a longer device because you need a lot of mobility. So there is some anchor point, you're working at the edge and there's an anchor point behind you somewhere and you're anchored to it. Say you're using a 30 or 50 foot device, gives you 30 or 50 feet of mobility on either side of your anchor point. Now, if you should slip off and you're working adjacent to the anchor point, you will always be involved in what's called a swing fall, which forces you to move back towards center or where the actual anchor point is. And in a fall, what's happened in the past is that as somebody swang back and forth until the momentum subsided, the potential, whether it was steel or concrete or whatever the line was abrading on, could be cut. So their fall was arrested safely. They were swinging back and forth, and because of this cutting motion on the cable, it would be cut and they would fall, and to further injury or death, unfortunately. So leading edge came in, and there is an extra energy absorber on the line, and it kind of looks like a regular energy absorbing pack on a lanyard, but it isn't. It's solely there to protect the line. So the braking mechanism inside the device will arrest your fall, and there's an external pack which will start to tear out to ensure that the line is not cut. So leading edge applications could be simply working at an outward edge where there's a drop, so off a mezzanine inside of a warehouse, new construction of buildings. Leading edge could also be working over top of equipment. So if you had to tie off on one side and crawl over top of something that is structurally structural steel or has the potential of an edge to cut your connecting device, then leading edge would fall in for that scenario as well. So there's actually quite a few instances where people are working at height and actually need leading edge and currently aren't. So if your line can contact any type of edge anytime you're using it, whether it is while you're working or in the potential of a fall, you must migrate over to leading edge equipment.
Sweet, thank you very much for that. The next question is, what is the absolute minimum a company should provide if they want to train employees in-house on fall protection and working at heights? Take it away.
I can take the training question. One, you would want to check with your legislation to start with, because, in Alberta, it just says your worker has to be trained in the equipment that they're going to use. In your province itself, and if you're in British Columbia, you'd probably want to go with a WorkSafe BC because it's actually approved and acknowledged by the BCCSA. Some provinces, unfortunately, they're leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to what legislation says that needs to be included in training. Some provinces are going to have a full list of things that need to be covered, and other legislation is going to be very vague. So obviously, you know, we're tackling the ABC. So if you think about what types of equipment they're using, well, everybody's got to have a harness if they're using fall protection. Then you've got your connecting components. So if you go through the ABCs of fall protection, they need to be trained in their anchors. They need to be trained in their body wear, and they need to be trained in what are the connecting components? How do I connect me to my anchor point? So what are those connecting components? I need to be trained in those. So whether that's a carabiner, snap hook, lanyard, need to be trained in all of those things, need to have information on all of those products that you're going to use. So like I said, there's a lot of provinces. The MOL made a standard, but it only was suitable for one industry over there in Ontario, and it didn't quite roll out the way it was supposed to, and it's just kind of a hot mess. So check your legislation, what their requirements are. See if there's a standard in your province. If you're not in the MOL, which is now already said that they will accept other programs as well, because I don't think their rollout over the last 5 years has gone that well. So there's the MOL, and then there's the BCCSA for British Columbia. Other than that, I'm personally not aware of any other standards in any other province that says you have to submit your program here for fall protection. That's not true. In Newfoundland, your program and your instructors need to be approved. So there's a different thing for Newfoundland. So those are the 3 provinces I'm aware of. Other than that, truly, you follow your legislation. And the other thing is, as the employer, let's remember competency and due diligence. So is the training you're going to provide to your worker, is that going to allow them to be competent in fall protection, right? So in the area of training, are they going to be able to gain some type of competency out of that? And obviously there's additional worksite training. And are you, as the employer, are you doing your due diligence? So have you effectively trained him in all the fall hazards? So that's another part of training. What are the fall hazards on the job site? So it's so much a part of training, it's actually part of a fall protection plan, which is required. So some people think of training as, oh my God, my guy has to go for 8 hours worth of training. Sometimes maybe it's 4 or 6 hours worth of training, and then you've got safety meeting opportunities. Those are also training opportunities. So as the CSA standard changes, you introduce that in one of your safety meetings, everybody signs off on it. Guess what? You just completed your competency. You kept people up to date on the information. They documented it, signed off on it. You now have something to prove that you have done ongoing to continuous training. So the training might be a 15-minute update in their fall protection. That's all it needs to be. So I don't have an answer that they should get 8 hours of fall protection. This is what it should include. Most, like I said, check your legislation. Most of them are going to say needs to be trained in the equipment that they're going to use. Some of them may be more stringent. So there's not a good solid answer for that.
Sweet. Well, thank you for giving for that answer. So I think we have time for about one more question. There was a lot of questions in the chat, so everyone who is panicking that we're not going to answer yours, don't worry. Somebody from our team will reach out to touch base with you about your question. But we have an amazing response, so thank you, everybody. The other thing I want to remind you before we do our last question is Jennifer's alluded a couple of times to the fall protection series, so you can watch all 8 parts of the webinar by going to Levitt-Safety.com, go to our resources and check webinars. We have the whole series there with Jennifer and myself. So our last question is, who is responsible for the ongoing inspection and documentation of permanent anchor points? Is it the building owner or is it the employer?
As long as they're inspected, it's the responsibility of the employer if they are working with and having the anchor points installed. The right answer is that they have to be inspected by an engineer. And a lot of times with experience, knowledge, etc., a supervisor can technically, if they are very aware of the strength of structural steel, they're very aware of how it's installed, the torque needed, what have you, they can also inspect anchor points, but they do have to be inspected. And again, generally the right answer is an engineer.
And there are periodic requirements for load testing as well. So they have to be pulled to their working load and documented again, as Scott said, by an engineer.
Correct.
And the qualified inspector could also be part of that process. And I'm not saying to sign that anchor up. Matt's over there laughing like she can't shut up. So he's laughing at me every time I talk. It's okay,
Never.
I got you. Don't worry. We're in this in 2022, buddy. You just wait. I don't even know what I was saying because you were laughing at me now, Scott.
Qualified inspector.
Qualified inspector, right, and the anchor points. So not to be the person who signs them off as an engineer, but maybe the qualified inspector is actually put to task to go around every 6 months. And we need to make sure that something hasn't been damaged along the way before we get to that 1 year interval. So it's not like we just put it up and don't ever look at it and don't touch it again unless we're going to tie off to it. There still needs to be that qualified person, or like Scott said, our qualified inspector. Maybe it's just a competent person, like a competent supervisor that's able to identify through his excessive training. You can't just go, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is what it's supposed to look like. Check, I'm the supervisor. No, he actually needs to have some training, be competent, do his due diligence. But again, if you've got a qualified inspector, part of that documented scheduled inspection program is making a timeline of, yeah, every month we're actually just going to go take a peek at those permanent anchor points and make sure we don't need an engineer to come here even sooner than our annual timeline.
And check the tag before you tie off to it.
100%.
Awesome. Gary, Jennifer, Scott, thank you all so much for doing this today. It means a lot, and clearly this is something that's needed because there's a lot of questions still in that chat. So thank you to everyone who joined us today, and we highly encourage you, if you want to learn more, to do the series that Jennifer and I put together. There's a lot of information, and Jennifer does a great job of presenting it. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and take care.
We promise to get back to you on those questions.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.